The desert sun beat down on the 20th of October, 2011. Here, beneath a highway outside Sirte, a man who had ruled Libya for 42 years was cornered in the concrete throat of a drainage culvert. Only hours before, he had slept in a compound, insulated by loyal guards and the unshakable belief that he could outwit his enemies. Now, caked in dust and blood, he pleaded with the fighters who pulled him into the unforgiving light. A swarm of cell phone cameras captured his final desperate moments, broadcasting images that would mark the violent end of a bizarre and brutal dictatorship. How a man of absolute power met his end on a roadside began in the 24 hours prior, a day that started with routine and spiraled into chaos. Dawn on October 19th revealed a city that had become a monument to its own destruction. Sirte, Gaddafi's coastal birthplace, had been under siege for weeks, its buildings gutted by artillery and its neighborhoods reduced to silent, sprawling ruins. Forces of the National Transitional Council, supported by NATO airstrikes, had tightened their cordon, but the last pockets of resistance fought with ferocious loyalty. Hiding pin pie within the inferno was Gaddafi himself, a ghost in District 2, a residential area now serving as his final stronghold. He moved restlessly between safe houses, never staying long, a nomad in his own dying kingdom. The compound where he spent the night of October 18th belonged to a trusted family, a modest structure worlds away from the palaces he once commanded, but it offered a fragile shield in proximity to his remaining men. The preceding months had been a nightmare of retreat and loss, as the uprising that began in February swept across the nation with astonishing speed. One by one, cities had fallen, and his own security apparatus had disintegrated, its officers defecting or simply vanishing. Family members had fled or been killed, while the international community, once willing to negotiate, had turned its full power against him. NATO warplanes owned the skies, hunting his forces relentlessly, shattering his grand visions of a united Africa into a desperate struggle for survival. Yet, even as his world shrank to a few city blocks, Gaddafi's defiance burned. He broadcast audio messages of resistance, his voice crackling through sympathetic channels, insisting that his people still loved him and that the rebels were merely foreign agents. Whether he truly believed his own words or was simply curating his legacy for posterity, he maintained a facade of absolute confidence. That morning, his security team delivered the grim news. The situation was deteriorating, and the compound was no longer safe. They had to move, and they had to move now. Gaddafi agreed, but with a strange absence of urgency, as if he believed he could outlast this threat, just as he had outlasted so many before. The morning air over Sirte hung thick with the dust of a city in its death throes. After surviving so many close calls, perhaps the dictator could not yet believe this time was different. A desperate gamble was underway. A convoy of between 40 and 50 vehicles began to form, a motley serpent of pickup trucks with mounted guns, SUVs filled with fighters, and supply vehicles laden with ammunition. Sprinkled among them were the few remaining luxury cars, carrying Gaddafi himself and the last of his inner circle, coordinated by his long-serving security chief, Mansour Dao. His presence, along with the dictator's son Mutassim, was a stark symbol of how many others had already fled, been captured, or were dead. Their plan was a thin thread of hope, to break south toward the town of Jarif, melt into the desert, and rally what loyalist forces remained. It was a choice born of desperation, for to stay in Sirte was to await a certain and final assault. Around 8 in the morning on the 20th of October, the preparations were complete, as armed men, supplies, and whatever valuables could be saved were loaded. At least movement offered a chance. Gaddafi appeared not in his extravagant robes, but in simple military attire, a stark contrast to his decades of pageantry. Yet he still carried a golden pistol, a garish symbol of the revolutionary leader he imagined himself to be. even now. By 8:30, the column was moving, winding through the skeletal remains of District 2, the drivers struggling to maintain distance through the rubble-choked streets. For the first stretch, their route offered a ghostly kind of cover as they passed the husks of burned-out buildings and the silent few who watched them slip by. Soon, they reached Highway 1, the main coastal road, the most vulnerable leg of their journey. The column accelerated, spreading out in a futile attempt to appear as civilian traffic, a fiction betrayed by the heavy weapons bolted to their trucks. For several kilometers, the road remained clear, and a fragile hope began to stir. But their every move was being tracked from an unforgiving sky. The desert sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the road. But unseen, high above the morning haze, the hunt was already underway. Any hope for an unnoticed escape vanished around 8 in the morning when a French reconnaissance aircraft detected the column of vehicles. While accounts differ on which NATO member first made the identification, the outcome was the same. Coordinates and information were relayed to command centers, and the decision to engage came swiftly. As a large military convoy moving through Loyalist territory, it was a legitimate target under the established rules of the mission. American Predator drones, armed with Hellfire missiles, silently slipped into position. They were soon joined by French fighter jets, their wings heavy with precision weapons. The convoy was just 4 kilometers west of Sirte when the sky opened up. At 8:30, the first missile slammed into a vehicle at the head of the column, flipping it in a devastating explosion of shrapnel and smoke. Chaos erupted instantly. Drivers floored accelerators or slammed on brakes, their instincts and training colliding in a moment of pure terror. Some attempted desperate U-turns back towards Sirte, while others simply abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot. Moments later, a second missile struck, then a third, as drones and jets made multiple passes over the highway, tearing the convoy apart. The column disintegrated under the relentless assault, vehicles scattered in every direction, some veering off-road into the desert scrubland, their occupants searching for any semblance of cover. The ammunition carried by several trucks detonated in sympathetic blasts, adding to the carnage. Amid the maelstrom, Gaddafi's own Toyota Land Cruiser was hit, the impact stunning him but leaving him without serious injury. His driver wrestled the damaged vehicle off the highway, finally lurching to a stop in a dried riverbed some 200 meters away. In the choking dust, the remnants of a desperate flight came to a halt. One vehicle shuddered to a stop inside a wadi, a dry riverbed gouged into the earth some 200 meters from the highway. Here, the dazed survivors of the convoy gathered, using the shallow depression as their only cover from the sky. They were now caught in a terrible vice, pinned between the relentless air assault from above and the rebel forces that the smoke and fire would inevitably draw. For what must have felt like an eternity, the strikes continued. NATO jets carved circles in the sky, their engines a constant menacing roar that filled the air for nearly an hour. They fired on any vehicle that tried to break away, on any cluster of armed men caught in the open. The world became a cacophony of screaming engines, whistling missiles, and thunderous explosions, punctuated by the sharp crack of ammunition cooking off in the burning wreckage. A ragged assembly of between 50 and 75 people had survived the initial onslaught, now huddled in the wadi and the surrounding ruins. Among them were Muammar Gaddafi, the security chief Mansour Dao, and a collection of bodyguards, commanders, and loyalist fighters. Many were wounded, their injuries sustained from shrapnel or the violent crashes of their escape. They possessed rifles and pistols, but against the warplanes circling above, they had nothing. Gaddafi and his inner circle convened amid the chaos, their conference hurried and grim. Their situation was dire, but a sliver of hope remained. If they could evade detection until dusk, the cover of darkness might offer a path out. The key was to remain unseen, to endure the waiting, and to pray they could fight their way through whatever enemy presence they might find. To improve their odds, the group made a fateful decision to separate. Some of the men remained in the wadi, while others sought refuge in nearby abandoned buildings. A small party, which included Gaddafi himself, crept toward a large drainage pipe running beneath the highway. The concrete culvert, only 1.5 meters in diameter, offered a dark, confining sanctuary from the air. As he crawled inside with his bodyguards, the ornate golden pistol he carried felt like a clumsy, useless weight. Deep within the pipe, shielded from view, they settled in to wait. The roar of the airstrikes gradually shifted, targeting other survivors farther down the road. The immediate explosive danger was replaced by a different kind of torment, the agonizing tension of silence and the unknown. But outside their concrete tomb, the smoke and fire had become a beacon for NTC forces already closing in. The distant thunder of explosions rattled the windows of Sirte, followed by plumes of black smoke staining the morning sky. On the ground, rebel forces knew this was no ordinary exchange of fire. Something decisive had just happened on the highway. Units that had been bracing for another day of grinding house-to-house combat immediately changed course, their vehicles churning up dust as they sped toward the source of the chaos. Across the radio waves, fragmented reports spread like wildfire, a large convoy, utterly shattered. Survivors were scattered, hiding. This was it. This could be the end. The men who answered the call were not a unified army, but a raw coalition of militias, defectors, and volunteers. Among the first to arrive were fighters from Misrata, a city that had endured a nightmarish siege by Gaddafi's loyalists months earlier. For them, this was not just war, it was retribution for the friends and family they had buried. They fanned out across the blighted landscape, a dragnet of grim-faced men. They moved through a grim tableau of burning vehicles and lifeless bodies, their search methodical and relentless. Brief, vicious firefights erupted as they cleared nearby buildings in a shallow ravine, flushing out small pockets of resistance. Some loyalists gave up at the sight of them. Others fought to their last bullet. 4 hours after the initial airstrikes, around 12:30 in the afternoon, a group of Misratan fighters closed in on a pair of wide drainage pipes beneath the road. How they found this specific location remains a story told in fragments. Some say it was a systematic search, others that a captured loyalist broke under questioning. Perhaps they simply saw fresh tracks in the dust. Whatever led them there, they approached with extreme caution. The concrete tubes offered a perfect hiding place and a perfect trap. They shouted commands for anyone inside to surrender, but only silence answered. Warning shots fired into the darkness yielded nothing. Finally, a fighter rolled a grenade into the mouth of one pipe, the detonation roaring through the confined space. Moments after the blast, panicked voices called out from the darkness. They were coming out. The fighters held their positions, weapons raised, as a line of dust-caked figures began to stumble into the harsh midday light, their hands held high. Then, from the shadows of the pipe, a man emerged who needed no introduction. Though his face was masked by blood and dirt, Muammar Gaddafi was unmistakable. His famously black-dyed hair was a chaotic mess, his expensive clothes torn and filthy. The carefully cultivated image of absolute power, projected for over 42 years, had evaporated. He was just a frail, wounded old man. The recognition was instantaneous, a jolt of electricity through the crowd. Shouts and curses erupted as dozens of cell phones were raised, their lenses ready to capture the final brutal chapter of his rule. In the dust and confusion, the end came not with a formal surrender, but with the cold lens of a dozen cell phone cameras. As they flickered to life, their pale blue light illuminated a scene of raw, chaotic victory. He was hauled from the drainage pipe into the blinding sun, a dazed and broken figure. Hands grabbed at him from every direction, the barrels of rifles pressing in. Through the shock of the grenade blast and the sheer terror of his capture, Gaddafi seemed to murmur a question, asking what he had done to deserve this. He could not comprehend that his 4 decades of iron-fisted rule had forged this very moment, this very rage. The fighters were not gentle. He was shoved, struck, and pulled through the jubilant crowd as more rebel units, alerted by crackling radio reports, swarmed the area. Alongside him, his son Mutassim and his security chief Mansour Dao were also dragged from their hiding places into the growing vortex of men and vehicles. What transpired over the next 30 to 60 minutes would become a storm of controversy, a blur of disputed facts and shaky, visceral footage. Those fragmented videos, later scrutinized by human rights organizations, show a man stripped of all authority, propped on the hood of a pickup truck. Blood stained his face and clothes, a stark testament to the violence of his final hour, though whether from the initial blast or the brutal handling of his captors remained unclear. Around him, the crowd swelled, some shouting, some filming, all witnesses to a history that was unraveling with terrifying speed. On paper, the path forward was clear: secure the prisoner, transport him to a secure location, and hold him for trial. The National Transitional Council had promised the world a new Libya, one governed by law. But on that roadside, surrounded by men who had lost brothers and fathers to his regime, official protocols felt like a distant abstraction. In the absence of a clear command structure, raw emotion was the only authority. A convoy of vehicles lurched into motion, a desperate attempt to impose order on the spiraling chaos. The prisoners were loaded inside, destined for Misrata, where NTC leadership awaited. But this journey, meant to end in a courtroom, would be cut brutally short. Suddenly, the roar of gunfire tore through the convoy. Accounts diverged. Was it a final futile ambush by loyalists or an internal reckoning from within the ranks? When the shooting stopped and the smoke cleared, Muammar Gaddafi was dead. His son Mutassim had also been killed. Only Mansour Dao survived to be taken into custody. The official NTC report would claim Gaddafi died in crossfire, a casualty of a battle that was still raging. But an autopsy, demanded by international observers, told a different story. A single, close-range gunshot wound to the head, a finding far more consistent with execution than combat. Instead of a quiet burial, his body, alongside his son's, was taken to Misrata. There, in a final grim spectacle, the remains of the fallen tyrant were put on public display, a testament to a revolution that had triumphed through violence and would now have to live with its consequences. In the cold, sterile air of a commercial meat locker, the final chapter of a tyrant's story was written. For days, the bodies of the fallen enemies were put on public display inside a shopping center in Misrata, where an endless queue of citizens snaked through the corridors. They came not to mourn, but to see, to confirm with their own eyes that the man who had cast a shadow over their lives for more than 4 decades was truly gone. This grim spectacle sent ripples of unease across the international community, with the United Nations and human rights groups voicing their deep concern. The act defied the Geneva Conventions and basic tenets of human dignity, yet for the people of Misrata, who had endured a brutal siege under his command, it was a necessary ritual. It was not about disrespect for the dead, but about tangible proof for the living, a visceral, undeniable form of closure. Meanwhile, the leadership of the National Transitional Council found itself cornered by uncomfortable questions. They had publicly committed to capturing Gaddafi alive, to a trial, to the rule of law. Instead, they were left to explain a death that looked far more like a summary execution than a casualty of combat. The official narrative, that he was killed in crossfire, convinced very few, but the sheer chaos of his capture made assigning blame a near impossible task. At a press conference, interim Prime Minister Mahmoud Jibril formally announced the dictator's demise, framing it as a moment of liberation for the entire nation. As his words went out, a wave of cathartic celebration erupted across Libya. The air filled with the sound of celebratory gunfire, the blare of car horns, and the sight of people waving flags in the streets, marking the violent end of a long and oppressive era. The global reaction was far more restrained. President Barack Obama spoke of a new chapter for the Libyan people, and European leaders echoed his cautious optimism. But beneath the diplomatic statements lay a deep-seated anxiety about the manner of Gaddafi's death and the unstable future that now lay before the country. By killing him, his captors had silenced him forever, eliminating any chance for a trial that might have brought truth, accountability, and a stronger foundation for justice. In the end, investigations into his final moments yielded reports, but no criminal charges. The political will to prosecute the fighters who had killed the dictator simply did not exist. With evidence of war crimes documented but ignored, Gaddafi's body was taken in secret to an unmarked grave somewhere in the vastness of the desert. His bizarre 42-year rule was over, but the nation he had forged in his own image remained. The dust of his fallen kingdom had not yet settled. His 42-year rule had come to this: a concrete drainage pipe beneath a desolate highway, the final refuge of a man who once commanded a nation. To comprehend the dictator's last day on earth, one must first witness the astonishing speed of his undoing, the complete disintegration of a world built on force, oil, and an erratic vision. The winds of the Arab Spring, having already toppled leaders in Tunisia and Egypt, finally reached Libya in February of 2011. It began in Benghazi, where calls for reform quickly swelled into a roar for Gaddafi's departure. The regime answered not with dialogue, but with live ammunition, as security forces were ordered to crush the demonstrations without mercy. From his capital, a furious Gaddafi appeared on television, branding the protesters as foreign agents and traitors, vowing to hunt them down and cleanse Libya house by house. Yet his threats, intended to terrorize, instead fractured his own power base. Unlike elsewhere, key segments of the Libyan military defected to the opposition, turning protest into armed rebellion. City after city fell, and soon the entire eastern half of the country had broken away. As Gaddafi's grip on the West began to slip, the international community intervened. In March, the United Nations authorized a no-fly zone to protect civilians, a mission that NATO forces quickly expanded into active support for the rebels. The skies over Libya filled with the roar of Allied jets, systematically dismantling the regime's command centers, communications, and military capacity from the air. Through the spring and summer, Gaddafi's world continued to shrink. His forces suffered one defeat after another, while international sanctions froze his assets and isolated his government. Even his own family began to fracture, some fleeing to neighboring countries, others perishing in the conflict. By August, the rebels were at the gates of Tripoli, and the regime's exhausted forces, battered by months of fighting, could not hold. When the capital fell, Gaddafi vanished. For weeks, his whereabouts were a mystery, punctuated only by defiant audio messages in which he promised to die fighting on Libyan soil. He had fled to his birthplace of Sirte, a city where loyalty still ran deep. There, surrounded by forces of the new government, the final siege began. A brutal, grinding battle that trapped thousands of civilians in a crossfire from which there was no escape. The dust of Sirte hung thick in the autumn air, a bitter haze of smoke and ruin. For the civilians trapped inside, life had become an agonizing weight, caught between warring factions with dwindling supplies of food, water, and medicine. By mid-October, the city was all but lost to the National Transitional Council, with only a few districts still fiercely contested. Within this shrinking perimeter, Gaddafi remained, encircled by a diminishing band of loyalists. He had been given chances to flee, to seek exile in a neighboring state, or to negotiate a surrender that might have guaranteed his safety. Whether through a stubborn belief in his own myth, sheer pride, or an inability to grasp that his time was over, he chose to stay. This final desperate stand was not happening in a vacuum. It was a chapter in the immense upheaval of the Arab Spring, which had ignited in Tunisia in December of 2010. There, the self-immolation of a street vendor had sparked a fire of protest that engulfed the region, toppling presidents in Tunisia and Egypt and plunging Syria into a devastating civil war. Yet the fire in Libya burned differently. The uprising here had spiraled into a full-scale civil war with astonishing speed, drawing in a more direct and sustained international intervention than anywhere else. The regime's collapse was consequently more violent, its end more absolute. The grainy footage of Gaddafi's death, captured on a mobile phone and broadcast globally, became a defining and brutal symbol of how far a dictator could fall. But the hope that his removal would usher in an era of democracy was quickly shattered. Libya descended into chaos, torn apart by competing militias, regional fractures, and eventually a renewed civil war. The nation became a failed state, a breeding ground for terrorist groups and human trafficking. Its future, a landscape of humanitarian crises. The bizarre legacy of Gaddafi's 42-year rule weighed heavily on the country, for he had deliberately hollowed out the very institutions that might have held it together. The foundations of the state Gaddafi left behind were built on sand. He had hollowed out Libya, leaving it without the civilian structures needed to govern, instead playing tribes and regions against one another in a labyrinthine game of control. These meticulously engineered divisions were a powder keg, primed to explode the moment he was gone. The nation's immense oil wealth, which could have forged a modern and prosperous society, was diverted to fuel his grandiose ambitions and a sprawling security apparatus. His bizarre political manifesto, the Green Book, offered a rambling alternative to capitalism and communism, but in reality, it was a monument to his own eccentricities. This cult of personality left no room for any alternative leader to emerge from his shadow, ensuring a vacuum of power would follow his inevitable demise. His foreign policy was just as volatile, sponsoring terrorist groups in the 1980s, which earned him global condemnation and isolation. He pursued weapons of mass destruction until 2003, when he bargained them away for normalized relations with the West. He then styled himself a Pan-African visionary, proposing a United States of Africa with himself at its head. For his own people, his rule was a strange and brutal paradox, a mixture of paternalism and raw terror. Oil money funded subsidies that provided a standard of living higher than many regional neighbors, but this came at the cost of all political freedom. The notorious revolutionary committees and other security services were everywhere, their eyes and ears monitoring the populace. Dissent was not tolerated, it was crushed, with public executions broadcast as a chilling warning. Thousands languished in political prisons, and entire communities were displaced if they fell from his favor. The final frantic images of Gaddafi, bloodied and bewildered as he was dragged from a drainage pipe, became a stark lesson on the fragility of absolute power. For 42 years, he had seemed untouchable, outlasting rivals and surviving numerous assassination plots. Yet in the end, his authority evaporated in a matter of months, and he died on a dusty roadside at the hands of his own people. The speed of his collapse was breathtaking. In February of 2011, his grip on Libya was absolute. By October, he was dead. The intricate mechanisms of control he had spent decades perfecting proved brittle when truly tested. The security services that had weaponized fear either defected or became powerless once the people's fear finally broke. Unlike the despots of previous eras, Gaddafi's final humiliating moments were documented not by state media, but by ordinary citizens wielding smartphones. The raw footage spread across the globe in hours, stripping away the propaganda to reveal a frightened old man, defeated and mortal. This raw transparency, this inability to control the narrative at the very end, signaled a new era in the unraveling of regimes. His death, however, left behind a disquieting silence. The questions of what a trial might have yielded continue to echo. What secrets might he have revealed about his international supporters? Would a courtroom reckoning have provided a truer sense of justice for his victims? That opportunity for legal accountability and a formal historical record was lost in the chaos. The role of the international community remains a subject of intense debate. NATO's intervention almost certainly prevented a massacre, but it also transformed a rebellion into a full-scale war. It was an intervention that saved lives, yet it also contributed to the very instability that would consume Libya for years to come. The final hours unfolded under a sky that offered no mercy, the mission to protect civilians having long since spiraled into a grim pursuit of regime change. In retrospect, the trajectory of Muammar Gaddafi's last 24 hours seems almost preordained. From the morning of October 19th to the following midday, a cornered autocrat's desperate breakout from Sirte was destined to end in ruin, his convoy shattered by airstrikes, his life extinguished in the chaos of capture. Yet for the man at the center of the storm, each moment must have been thick with uncertainty. Waking on that final morning, did he still believe escape was possible, or did he contemplate the terms of a surrender? The defiant propaganda recordings from his last months offer few clues to his inner world. The decision to risk a daylight convoy was a catastrophic gamble, a move under the cover of darkness or a moment's distraction for NATO aircraft might have altered his fate. But history rarely bends to such hypotheticals. His world had shrunk to the confines of a concrete drainage pipe, a damp and suffocating darkness. The sounds of the hunt, of approaching footsteps and angry shouts filtered through the concrete. For a man who had commanded armies from opulent palaces and met world leaders as an equal, this final degradation was a complete and terrifying reversal. The hours spent huddled in that squalid tube must have been an excruciating torment, knowing discovery meant either capture or death. The end, when it came, was brutal and devoid of dignity. Whatever crimes defined his long rule, the manner of his killing, filmed and broadcast for the world, transformed an act of retribution into a disturbing public spectacle. It was a conclusion that sidestepped justice, raising profound questions from both a humanitarian and legal standpoint. His death was the grim harvest of seeds sown over decades, a repressive regime, a failure to build legitimate institutions, and a growing detachment from reality. When his people finally rose against him, the pillars of fear and force that had propped up his power for so long simply crumbled, leaving nothing. Libya continues to wrestle with this violent legacy, a nation still fractured, unstable, and haunted by the unfulfilled promise of its 2011 revolution. The loss of accountability that a formal trial might have offered did little to help a country searching for a foundation of justice and reconciliation. The images from that day remain a powerful, unsettling testament to the end of an era. They show the death of a dictator, but also the chaos that rushes in when one order collapses before another is ready to take its place. It was a tragedy not of innocence, for he was not innocent, but of squandered potential. A peaceful transition, a dignified abdication, a trial in a court of law, all were sacrificed for a roadside death, captured on the cold, indifferent lenses of a dozen cell phone cameras.